Brad Blakeman was a senior advisor to President George W. Bush during his administration and was working in the White House on September 11, 2001. He sat down with Carolee McGrath recently to share his remembrances of the events of that day and the days that followed.
I was in my office in the West Wing of the White House, and basically it was a morning like we had countless times. It started with a 7 a.m. senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt Room, and then once that meeting was concluded, we went back to our offices and began our day of work. I was in my office, always had the television on because as the president's gatekeeper, scheduler, I knew that the president's schedule could be affected by news, and certainly this day was an example of that. And when I had heard that a first plane had hit the tower, coming from New York, understanding that there was an attack on the Trade Center before, I found it odd that a small aircraft on a beautiful day with unlimited visibility would hit that tower. And so I was thinking about that. Not shortly after that, the second plane had hit. And I turned to my assistant, Kara Fig, and I said, "This is an act of terrorism." And I left my desk and walked down the hall to the Situation Room, expecting them to have more information, and they did not. They were watching things happen in real time, as everybody else. And there's a delay in what's happening to what you know. And then shortly after that, the Secret Service evacuated the West Wing. The plane that eventually crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, they said was heading for the White House. So we were evacuated. We went to another location. I had about 150 staff with me, and we continued to work. Shortly thereafter, my sister had called that her son has been unreachable. Her son was a New York State court officer who was assigned to the courts not far from the World Trade Center. Unbeknownst to us, he had responded to the scene and was evacuating people. He was told to leave, and his last transmission on his radio was, "People need my help," and he wouldn't leave. And eventually we came to find out that the tower had collapsed and he perished. But we continued to work, and then there came a time that day where I sent the staff home while it was still light, and then 4 of us returned to the White House because we were told the president would be returning and to address the nation later that evening, and so we prepared for that. And then typically I had the president scheduled for 21 days. That schedule was now irrelevant, and we were scheduling by the minute. And so we were meeting and communicating with senior staff, understanding what the president wanted to do, making that happen. And in the meantime, my sister was calling, my brother, who was on the board of the Port Authority, was a commissioner, was calling me about my nephew, but also about any information that I may glean to him with regard to what happened at the Trade Center. And so it was a tough period of time between my official responsibility and then giving my family information that I could publicly give to them. And then there came a time when we understood Tommy would not be recovered. The only thing they ever found was his badge and his gun. His body was never recovered, so he's there. And the president, when he first found out the next day, on the 12th of September, that my nephew was missing, he first called me, and he said, "We're going to pray for Tommy, and we're going to find the people who did this and bring them to justice." And then a couple of minutes later, he was at my desk telling me the same thing. So it was an amazing, surreal experience, because the things that you would expect to happen while you're serving the president, some of it is unimaginable until it happens, and then you have to respond accordingly. But I have to say, we had the right leadership at the right time between the president, Secretary Carter, our chief of staff, and our cabinet, and our staff at the White House. They rose to the occasion. They did their job, and I was very proud to serve them at this time.
How were you able to manage both your official role, serving the president, and realizing that your nephew was unaccounted for?
Because you had a mission, and the mission was bigger than my personal connection. And I knew the type of person Tommy was. He was a person of service.
Military background.
Military background. He was a combat-trained Army medic. And I knew in my gut that he was there, because that's where I expected him to be. And based on his history, there's no place he would have rather been. So he did what he wanted to do for the right reasons. So it was a blessing that he was there because he was able to save people.
And you know, when you think back on 9/11, there's a picture in particular that always sticks out in my mind of that firefighter walking up the stairs and everybody else coming out. Obviously, right. That sounds like the service of your nephew and so many others who went in when everybody else was running out.
Right. And you never know what type of person you are or you're capable of being until that happens. You'd like to think you would do that, but you never really know. And in the White House, I saw a lot of people rise to the occasion. There were people who did things that were admirable. When I sent my staff home, many of the staff asked to stay. You know, they didn't have to. We didn't know what was coming next, if anything. Yet people wanted to serve.
Shortly thereafter, you went with President Bush to Ground Zero. Tell us about that.
No, I planned that.
You planned that?
I didn't go, and the reason is because the president had to go with a small footprint. When the president said, "When do I go?" You need to go, but you can't go the way we typically go.
Right.
You can't sterilize the place. You can't sweep and do security searches because it's a recovery site. You can't bring the typical members that you normally would bring. So it had to be a very small group of people. Only the ones, a lot of people wanted to go. The question was, did you need to go? I didn't need to go. I would have loved to have gone because of the connection, but it was not my place to be there. I didn't have to be there. So the president took a very small footprint. The Secret Service didn't do what they normally would do because it was a recovery site. And the president was able to deliver his message at the place of attack, one of the places, and to also comfort the families who were still, you know, at that point not knowing what was happening. So it was very important for the president to go. He did. It was totally unscripted. What you saw is what happened.
And him standing there on the pile of rubble saying, "I hear you, and soon the whole world will hear us." I mean, those are words that I think people will never forget. You know, standing next to the firefighter, you know, saying that to a nation that was just brokenhearted right. at that time.
That's where leaders come to be. And you can really appreciate them for who they are and what the metal that's in them. I knew it from the time I knew him as George when I was working for his dad. And the world came to know it on that day. And it started from the very time Secretary Card whispered in his ear that America's under attack. You saw a president who was calm and cool and collected
and who took
deliberate.
criticism for not jumping up. But he was standing there before a classroom of little kids, and I remember this one little kid standing in front of him with a big smile on his face because President Bush was behind him and they right. were singing a song, and he just kind of stood there.
Right. And he had the press corps there. What a president does, how he does, and where he does it is as important as to what he says. And if we would have saw a president that had panicked or that had responded inappropriately, it would have been a totally different story. The president didn't know a lot at that point other than America was under some kind of attack. We didn't know how severe it was. But on the other hand, the president had to remain calm, not only for the school children who were in front of him, for a press corps, for a nation. And eventually, when he did have the ability to gain more knowledge, he responded just as you would expect a leader to respond. Calm, cool, collected, deliberate, honest, and well-intended. You can't ask for more than that.